If you are feeling exhausted, disoriented, and unable to make sense of what has just happened to your life, I want you to know this first. You are not alone. Being with a narcissist is like being trapped inside an endless house of mirrors where every corridor reflects a distorted version of reality, and every face you encounter is nothing more than an empty mask. You run desperately searching for an exit, believing that this time you have finally reached the door to freedom the moment you hope is the final discard, only to slam headfirst into yet another cold sheet of glass. The terrifying truth slowly reveals itself. The narcissist never truly leaves. They simply retreat into a hidden corner, silently watching as you fracture under overwhelming confusion. The deepest pain is not when they turn their back and walk away. It is the moment you realize you are standing in the middle of layered illusions, unable to tell which path leads to real freedom and which one is just another psychological trap waiting behind the glass. Their presence becomes like a psychological ghost, always keeping one foot in the doorway, leaving you permanently suspended in the question: is the exit in front of me real, or just another cruel deception? To break free from this mirrored maze, you need more than patience. You need the clarity to see through the unspoken rules the narcissist has been using to manipulate your reality all along. And in today's video, we are going to uncover 5 brutal but necessary truths about the narcissist's so-called final discard, so you can finally find the exit not for the relationship, but for your soul. And it is precisely from that sense of confusion, from the moment you find yourself standing inside the house of mirrors, questioning whether the exit in front of you is real, that we need to pause and face the first truth, a truth that is difficult to accept, yet deeply liberating. When you believe you are facing the final discard, what is actually taking place is not an ending, but a profound disruption in perception. Because in the psychological world of a narcissist, the concept of an ending does not exist the way it does for a healthy person. For you, leaving means loss, grief, and a door closing so healing can begin. For the narcissist, leaving is not an emotional separation, but a technical maneuver designed to reassert control. This distinction is critical, because as long as you interpret the final discard as an emotional decision, you will remain trapped inside the house of mirrors. The narcissist does not exit the relationship on an inner level. They merely shift position within the power structure. They withdraw just enough to create absence, because it is that absence that destabilizes you, fuels self-doubt, and unconsciously pushes you to adjust your behavior in hopes of pulling them back. In this system, discard is not a full stop, but a lever. It is used to re-establish their position at the center of your psychological world. You begin asking yourself what you did wrong, what you could fix, whether you can still save it, and in that moment, the trap closes, because instead of leaving the house of mirrors, you start orbiting it more intensely. What makes this experience especially cruel is the uncertainty. You cannot tell whether this is truly the end or simply another manipulation, but the cold truth is that, in many cases, the narcissist does not know either, not because they lack intelligence, but because their psychological structure operates on pressure, not long-term intention. When they feel threatened, challenged, or unable to regulate their self-image in your presence, they retreat. When they feel deprived of validation or supply, they return. Everything revolves around a single axis, what stabilizes their fragile ego in the present moment. This is why trying to determine whether a discard is final becomes an unwinnable game. There are no stable rules, no consistent logic, only survival reflexes driven by external reflection. This is exactly why the relationship feels like a house of mirrors, endless reflections without a solid core to anchor reality. And when you finally recognize that the discard is not about their departure, but about manipulating your sense of presence, a new doorway begins to appear. The question is no longer, will they come back? But why does their absence disorient me so deeply? And that question marks the true beginning of the exit. Once you begin to see that discard is not an emotional ending but a maneuver of power, the next natural question arises. Why does it have such a strong grip on your mind? The answer does not lie in willpower, nor in you being not strong enough, but in how the narcissistic psychological system is built around reflection. At a deeper level, the narcissist does not maintain a sense of self through inner experience, but through constantly seeing themselves reflected through others. You are not simply a partner or a bond, you are a reflective surface that allows them to feel real, valuable, and in control. When that reflection is stable, their persona operates smoothly. When reflection is disrupted, the entire system comes under pressure. Discard, at this level, is not about leaving you, but about rapidly reducing unconscious pressure. They withdraw not to lose you, but to regain control over their self-image. This explains why they can appear cold, detached, and then return as if nothing ever happened. In their inner logic, you are not experienced as an autonomous subject with your own inner world, but as a function within their ego-regulating system. When that function stops working properly, they do not grieve as you do, they adjust the system. This is where the House of Mirrors becomes most dangerous for you. Because when you are removed from the reflective position, your brain does not interpret it as a technical maneuver, but as an attachment threat. Your nervous system responds with anxiety, confusion, and an urgent need to understand and restore connection. Meanwhile, their system feels temporary relief because the pressure has been reduced. This mismatch creates a painful paradox. The more you search for meaning, the more mechanical they become. The more you seek closure, the further they retreat from genuine feeling. What you are experiencing is not personal failure, but a collision between two entirely different psychological structures. One seeks connection to regulate emotion, the other seeks control to avoid ego collapse. And because the narcissist cannot tolerate inner ambiguity, they must re-establish reflection as quickly as possible. This is why discard is often followed by a new person, a new story, a new display of stability. Not because healing has occurred, but because the system needs a new reflective surface before the inner void can speak. What matters for you to see is that no reflection ever truly resolves that unconscious pressure. It only postpones it. And with every postponement, the system becomes more dependent on controlling others to survive. This is where manipulation becomes most subtle, because as long as you are still reacting, still trying to understand, still waiting for explanation, you are inadvertently providing reflective data. Even your pain can serve as proof that they still occupy the center of your psychological world. When you grasp this, a quiet but decisive shift begins to occur. You realize the real issue is not whether they will return, but whether you will continue to stand in the reflective role. Because as long as you remain a mirror, discard can never be final. It is simply a rhythm within the power loop. But the moment you begin to withdraw reflective energy, not through anger or retaliation, but through inner disengagement, the pressure in that system can no longer be regulated. And that is the moment the House of Mirrors begins to lose its power to hold you. As the initial shock of the so-called final discard begins to settle, another quiet yet persistent need takes over your inner world, the need for closure. You are not only hurting because of loss, you are hurting because nothing makes sense. Your brain, wired to restore order after disruption, begins to search for meaning as a survival mechanism. You want an explanation, a final conversation, a moment of clarity that would allow you to place a period at the end of this story and begin healing. That need is not weakness, it is a deeply human response to attachment trauma. But this is precisely where the House of Mirrors reveals its most subtle and dangerous trap. Because for a narcissist, closure is not merely something they refuse to give, it is something they are structurally incapable of producing. Closure requires an inner architecture they never developed, the capacity for emotional accountability, the ability to review the course of a relationship without distorting reality, and the tolerance to hold two opposing truths at once, that they crave connection while simultaneously causing harm. For the narcissist, such contradictions are not processed, they are severed to preserve the persona. So when you seek closure from them, you are seeking resolution from a system that has no mechanism for resolution. What you typically receive is not clarity, but deeper confusion, half answers, meaningless explanations, or rewritten narratives that make you question your own memory and perception. Each time this happens, your mind loops again, believing that one more piece of information will finally make things make sense. This is exactly how the House of Mirrors holds you captive, through unanswered questions that never stabilize. True closure does not arise because the truth is spoken by them. It arises because the truth is stabilized within you. As long as you look outward for closure, you remain standing in front of the mirror, waiting for their reflection to tell you how to feel about what happened. This explains why the search for closure can prolong suffering longer than the relationship itself. Not because you cannot let go, but because the reflective system is still active. Every unanswered message, every appearance and disappearance, every ambiguous signal becomes fuel for rumination. And the narcissist, whether consciously or unconsciously, benefits from this dynamic because as long as you seek answers from them, they remain the center of the story in your mind. On a neurobiological level, the pursuit of closure activates the same reward circuits associated with addiction. The brain learns to associate emotional relief with the possibility of understanding more, making analysis itself a dependency. On a depth psychological level, it is dependence on their persona to define your reality. This is why it must be stated clearly and without illusion. Closure does not come from a final conversation. It comes from the moment you accept that this story has no ending in the form you hoped for, not because you did not deserve clarity, but because that structure was never designed to offer it. When you stop demanding rational explanations from an avoidance-based, control-driven system, you begin withdrawing energy from the House of Mirrors. That withdrawal will initially feel more destabilizing, not less, because your mind has been conditioned to loop in search of meaning. Yet it is precisely in the absence of answers that a new order begins to emerge, one that no longer depends on the other person's recognition, explanation, or admission. You begin to shift from the question, "Why did they do this?" to the question, "What within me needs healing so I no longer seek answers there?" This moment marks the transition from reflection to autonomy. You no longer need to understand them in order to understand yourself. You no longer require their narrative to close this chapter, and when you stop seeking closure where it cannot be given, the House of Mirrors loses its greatest power, the ability to keep you trapped by a question that will never be answered. When you begin withdrawing reflection, when you stop seeking closure, stop explaining, stop arguing, to be understood, a very specific movement occurs within the narcissistic system, and that movement is often misinterpreted as sudden malice. In reality, cruelty and smear are not emotions. They are survival reflexes of a structure losing stability. Before this point, you functioned as a regulating surface. You reacted, you questioned, you suffered, you tried to repair, and all of that inadvertently kept their persona buoyant. Even while hurting you, they still had a role to play, the one in control, the one who was right, the misunderstood one, the one who left first. But the moment you fall silent in a way that no longer revolves around them, the moment you stop performing as an audience for their narrative, the persona loses feedback, and a persona without reflection does not merely weaken, it begins to fracture. It is precisely at this fracture point that cruelty emerges not as impulsive rage, but as a forced attempt to restore the old order. The smear campaign, therefore, is not a personal act of revenge. It is a systemic maneuver designed to redefine reality once direct reflection disappears. When they defame you, distort events, label you unstable, toxic, betraying, or ungrateful, the deeper goal is not primarily to hurt you, though that occurs, but to construct a collective mirror. If you no longer react, they seek reaction through others. If you no longer validate their role, they compel the environment to do it for you. Cruelty escalates because unconscious pressure escalates. At a deeper level, when reflection is withdrawn, the shadow moves closer. The shadow here is not evil in a moral sense. It is the entire experience of powerlessness, smallness, and worthlessness. The narcissistic structure has spent a lifetime avoiding. Every time you remain silent, every time you do not collapse as predicted, the shadow knocks louder. and because they lack the inner language to dialogue with the shadow, they externalize it. Cruelty, coldness, spite, even destruction becomes the only way to numb the sense of threat. This is why so many people observe the same pattern. The moment they stop reacting, stop chasing, stop apologizing, the level of hostility intensifies. Not because you did something wrong, but because you removed the only thing keeping that system from destabilizing reflection. Smear serves another, more subtle function. It seals off the return path to truth. Once the story is publicly contaminated, once you are assigned the role of the problem, self-reflection becomes dangerous, because any honest moment would threaten the entire defensive structure. Escalation becomes mandatory, more lies, more rigidity, more emotional flattening, not because they are powerful, but because retreat is no longer possible. At this stage, many fall into the most costly trap, trying to prove the truth, correct the narrative, defend their integrity. Yet every attempt pulls you back into the house of mirrors through another corridor. Smear cannot be dismantled by truth because it does not operate on truth. It operates on perceptual control. The only force that actually drains it is consistent withdrawal from the stage. When there is no reaction, no argument, no opponent, the narrative loses momentum. This does not lead to moral awakening. It forces the system to confront the emptiness it has always avoided. And this is why, during smear and cruelty, it is crucial to understand this is not evidence that you are losing. It is evidence that you have touched the most vulnerable point of the narcissistic structure. You do not need to engage, counterattack, or justify yourself. Your stillness, your autonomy, your refusal to reflect is precisely what exposes the system's impotence. Smear and cruelty are not the end of your story. They are the convulsions of a system losing its source of sustenance. And then, after all the spirals of confusion, cruelty, smearing, and silence, a quiet but irreversible truth begins to emerge. The real ending does not occur inside the narcissist. It occurs inside you. There is no moment of awakening on their side, no delayed apology, no final conversation where everything is named correctly and resolved. Not because you did not deserve it, but because that structure was never built to arrive at a healthy ending. The narcissist does not live through inner truth, they live through avoidance. So they do not close stories, they simply carry them to another stage, with different characters and different masks. But there is one point their repetition cannot follow: the moment you withdraw your energy from the entire performance. When you stop reacting, stop defending, stop seeking closure, stop trying to prove yourself right or them wrong, you do not merely leave the relationship, you leave the system. And that is the only thing that truly ends the house of mirrors. Your silence at this stage is no longer the silence of fear or injury. It is sovereign silence. A silence that does not need to be understood, validated, or reflected by anyone in order to exist. Within that silence, for the first time in a long while, you are no longer living in reaction. You begin living in presence. And it is this presence that creates the fundamental divergence between your path and theirs. While the narcissistic structure continues revolving around avoidance, escalating control, or contracting to preserve itself, you enter a completely different process: integration. Integration is not forgetting what happened, nor is it forgiveness in a moral sense. It is the capacity to hold the entire experience without allowing it to define you. You do not need to deny the shadow in order to live. You learn to face it without being consumed by it. You learn to endure emotion without cutting the circuit, without fleeing, without constructing a persona just to survive. This is where the deepest difference appears. The narcissist lives to avoid one single truth about themselves. You, by leaving and refusing to return to the game, choose to live with your truth, not to defeat them, but to no longer be forced to exist inside their story. If anything happens inside the narcissist after everything you have endured, it is no longer the center of this journey. What matters far more is what happens inside you when you are no longer a mirror for anyone else. There is no empty vacuum that must be filled by someone's reaction, no emotional numbness mistaken for peace. No cycle of escalation or contraction to survive. Instead, there is a rare possibility, returning to a self that does not need external reflection to know it exists. And that is the true exit from the House of Mirrors. Not by running faster, understanding more, or enduring better, but by stopping, withdrawing energy, and stepping off the stage. When you do, the story does not end with a loud explosion. It closes in silence. And that silence is freedom.